There are moments in the nation's history when time itself seems to stop. When the Constitution, the document we trust to be our shield, becomes a cage. For India, that moment came on the night of June 25th, 1975. The Prime Minister declared an emergency. Civil liberties were suspended, dissent was silenced, newspapers were censored, political leaders were jailed, and for the first time since independence, the very idea of democracy was put in chains. The question is not whether laws were followed. The question is what happens when law itself bonds before power. The emergency of 1975 to 1977 was not just a political event, it was a constitutional earthquake, an experiment in authoritarianism carried out under the cloak of legality. And it forces us to confront some uncomfortable questions even today. Can a constitution designed to guarantee freedom also be weaponized? To suspend it? Can the rule of law survive when rulers themselves rewrite the meaning of law? And most importantly, did we as a people learn from those 21 months of darkness? Or have we only chosen to forget? This episode of The Next Hearing, India's Constitutional Dialogue series, is not about nostalgia. It is about power. The emergency is not an old chapter tucked away in history textbooks. It is a warning, a mirror reflecting what happens when institutions weaken, when fear replaces debate, and when convenience trumps over constitutional morality. In this video, I want to take you into the anatomy of emergency, its legal justifications, its political triggers, the battles in the Supreme Court, the silenced voices in Parliament, and the scars it left on India's democratic soul. Because to understand the emergency is to understand the fragility of freedom. And to understand that is to realize our democracy is never automatic. It must be defended always. So let's begin. Let us reopen the files of 1975 and let us ask what really happens when the Constitution is in chains. Good afternoon. Welcome to The Next Hearing. Tonight we step into one of the darkest, most complex and most misunderstood chapters in India's constitutional history. The emergency of 1975 to 1977. For 21 months, the Constitution, the grand charter of our freedoms, was placed in chains. Fundamental rights were suspended, dissenters were jailed, press was gagged, judiciary faltered, parliament bent. But here's the question that should haunt us. Was it only one person's decision, or was it the system itself, designed, allowed, and even complicit? This isn't just a story of power versus people. It is the test case of what happens when a democracy willingly trades liberty for order. Let's enter the courtroom of history. The case is the Constitution of India versus the emergency. In part 1, we will discuss the political climate before emergency. Every emergency had roots. It doesn't arise suddenly. The early 1970s were years of turbulence, economic slowdown, inflation, shortages, protests, J.P. Narayan calling for total revolution, students filling the streets, strikes halting factories, governance looked weak, authority looked fragile, and then came the spark. The Allahabad High Court verdict of June 12, 1975, Justice Jagmohan Lal Sinha declared Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's election to the Lok Sabha invalid. Corruption and malpractices in campaigning were proven. Suddenly, the sitting Prime Minister was disqualified. The Supreme Court refused a full stay, only a conditional release. Imagine the tension. The Prime Minister of the largest democracy, now in technical illegitimacy. The political opposition on the streets demanding resignation. And J.P. Narayan calling the armed forces to follow their conscience and not illegal orders. It was a moment of collision between law and survival, between legitimacy and authority. That collision would produce the emergency. In part 2, we will discuss the declaration of emergency. On the night of June 25, 1975, India's constitutional soul was tested. President Fakhruddin Ali Ahmed, on the advice of Prime Minister, signed the proclamation under Article 352. The ground, internal disturbances. This was the constitutional loophole, vague, undefined, and dangerously broad. It allowed the suspension of democracy, not because of war or rebellion, but because of a phrase that could mean almost anything. At midnight, power lines were cut, Opposition leaders were arrested. Morarji Desai, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, L.K. Advani, J.P. Narayan himself. Newspapers were censored. Headlines pre-approved by government officers overnight. India changed. The constitution was not abolished, but it was weaponized against itself. This was the brilliance and the horror of the emergency. It did not come with tanks on the street, but with signatures on official papers. Legality became the mask of tyranny. In part 3, let's discuss the machinery of control. Let us examine the three institutions: Parliament, Judiciary, and media. Parliament reduced to a rubber stamp, laws passed at lightning speed, constitutional amendments bulldozed. The 42nd Amendment, known as the Mini Constitution, strengthened the executive, weakened the judiciary, and declared India to be a socialist republic. Even the preamble was touched. Imagine those sacred opening words tempered within the silence of fear. Judiciary, the darkest hour came in ADM Jabalpur versus Shivkant Shukla. The Supreme Court by majority held that during the emergency, even the right of life under Article 21 could be suspended. Justice H.R. Khanna stood alone in dissent, warning that without the right to life, the Constitution itself had no meaning. That lone dissent later became immortal. But in that movement, the court bowed. Media was censored, muted, domesticated. The Indian Express left its editorial pages in blank and in silent protest. Cartoonists smuggle messages between lines, but most complied. The lesson: the institutions do not collapse in a bang. They erode in whispers, compromises, and fears. And then there was Sanjay Gandhi. Extra constitutional power, sterilization drives, slum demolitions, authoritarian experiments, all in the name of discipline and modernization. It was not just an emergency of law, it was an emergency of vision, one where liberty was sacrificed at the altar of control. In part 4, let's discuss the people's response. But what of the people? Here lies the paradox. For millions, life continued as usual. Trains ran on time, strikes stopped, streets looked orderly. To some, the emergency was discipline. To others, it was suffocation. Fear does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers. Neighbors stop speaking politics. Families warn their children not to question authority. The silence was deafening. And yet, beneath that silence, resistance grew. Underground presses printed pamphlets. Students carried secret messages. Political prisoners debated democracy inside jail cells. Democracy, in that period, survived not in institutions, but in whispers of defiance. In part 5, let's discuss the fall of emergency. No authoritarian spell lasts forever. By 1977, pressures mounted. The forced sterilization had angered rural India. The demolitions alienated the poor. Dissent could not be buried endlessly. And in a surprising move, Indira Gandhi called for elections, perhaps believing the people would reward order. But the ballot spoke differently. The Janata Party swept the polls. For the first time, the Congress was thrown out of power. The emergency ended not in a violent revolution, but with a vote. That is India's paradox. Tyranny was legal, but liberty returned peacefully. Let's discuss the lessons in part 6. So what do we really learn? The emergency of 1975 to 1977 was not just a story of one leader's will. It was the revelation of structural weakness of our constitution. That internal disturbance could suspend freedoms. That institutions could bow so quickly. That legality could be turned against liberty. But equally, it was the proof of resilience. That a single dissenting judge could become immortal. That an election could restore faith. That a democracy, though wounded, could heal. Here's the haunting truth. The emergency is not over. It lives in our memory, in precedent, in the possibilities of power. The real safeguard is not in the Constitution's text alone, but in the vigilance of citizens. As Dr. Ambedkar had warned, however good a Constitution may be, if those who are implementing it are not good, it will be proved to be bad. The next hearing, therefore, is not in the courtroom, not in Parliament, not in the pages of judgments. It is in our conscience, our vigilance, and our refusal to let liberty slip away again. This was the story of a constitution in chains, but the chains broke. The question is, will we recognize the signs if they return? Thank you. This is the next hearing, and we will meet again.